to both the virtue and the sacrament of penance and the discipline of penance. So in biblical theology, when we sin, we incur guilt, there's alienation, there's rupture in the relationship with God and with people for that matter. And God, or whoever we have offended, can extend forgiveness to us. We can be reconciled in our relationship. And yet that reconciliation does not obviate the need to make some sort of reparation, some sort of atonement for the crime or the offense that we have committed. I mean, just take a human illustration. If I am pulling my car out of the parking lot after this show and I back into Jack's car over here, and I come running in and say, Jack, I know you love your car, and maybe it's a new car, maybe it's not, I don't know, but you've got a great finish on it and good paint job, and I've messed it up, I'm so sorry. Jack's a decent fellow. He's going to say, Anderson, don't worry about it, I forgive you. But when I turn to walk out the door, he's going to say, and how about the number of your insurance agent, right? So I'm forgiving you. Like, this is not going to destroy our friendship, but I expect you to make reparation for what you did to the car, right? And we see the same thing in our relationship with God. So my favorite examples, of course, are from the book of Samuel, when David sins grievously against God, and he repents, and God forgives him, but then God imposes penance. You know, he gave David a choice, actually. You can do this, that, or the other thing. Pick your punishment, and David picks the plagues. Or when in 2 Samuel 24, when David goes and makes an offer, makes a sacrifice, and an Israelite comes by and says, well, here, you can take a cow from my field. And David says, no, I'll pay for it, because I'm not going to offer the Lord a sacrifice that costs me nothing. So the idea is I'm going to do something to make up for my offense, not as the condition of reconciliation, but as the fruits of reconciliation, because it's in the order of love and relationship, not just kind of strict proportionality and legal justice. So the question is, in antiquity, when people would sin and the church would impose penance, sometimes the church's penances would be quite lengthy. So we have records, for example, of people being excluded from Holy Communion as a penance for their whole life, up until their deathbed. And the Council of Nicaea and the canons made sure to insist that people that were doing penance be readmitted to communion if they were in danger of death. So that kind of gives you an idea of adultery, apostasy, murder. These were the kind of sins that would exclude people for this length of time. Well, that was a bit onerous, and there were people who thought that was a bit onerous, but they didn't want to be too, they wanted to be too severe, but they wanted to be too light either. And in the 250s in North Africa, during the Decian persecution, the Emperor Decius, some Christians were martyred, some were imprisoned, and some caved in, and they handed over the implements of worship, or they renounced Christ, and they apostatized. Well, the martyrs, of course, were venerated as martyrs and saints. The confessors, those that went to prison, were, of course, also venerated and hailed for doing the heroic thing. Many of those that lapsed were subjected to penance for the sin of apostasy. And this is a very important point to understand. The people who were doing penance, not the church officials, not the bishops, the people who were doing penance looked over at the confessors in prison, and they said, these guys are over there in prison. That's got to be worth a lot. That's really, Jesus said, if you give a cup of cold water, you won't lose your reward. What if you sit and rot in prison out of love for Jesus? That's got to be worth a lot. So they got a brilliant idea. They went over to the prisons, and they found the confessors in prison, and they said, we have a request. You're sitting here in prison. Would you let some of your merit count to my account? If you're sitting here, could we put that sitting there to use for the benefit of the people doing penance? I've been subjected to, say, maybe 3 years of abstention from the Eucharist. Maybe if you interceded with the bishop, he'd be willing to cut that down to 1.5 years. And then the lay people were writing what were called writs of indulgence, signed by the confessors in prison, that they sent back to Bishop Cyprian in Carthage, saying, I'll sit here in jail and rot away for this guy, but would you please cut 1.5 years off of his penance? And that was the origin of indulgences. And the logic of the thing goes to the idea of the communion of saints, that the righteousness of the few can avail on behalf of the many. And it's applying that to the act of penance. Now, when Cyprian got a hold of these letters, he said, okay, I see. Biblically, the logic works. This is a good position to take. I have only one request, and that is that the bishop be the one that adjudicates it. So I'm the one that gets to decide, how much and for whom and under what conditions. And so thus was born the practice of indulgences, where some work could be substituted for a penance imposed by the church, and one could do so by appealing to the merits of the confessors and the martyrs and the saints. I emphasize that this was something that was born out of the heart of the Christian people, out of popular piety, not some scheme invented by the hierarchy to make money.
And what about this whole notion of time frames being associated with these things back in the day?
Right. So that's very important, because you'll often find in the Origin of Indulgences that the church is offering an indulgence of like 300 days. And a lot of people think that means 300 days off of purgatory. It does not mean that. It means 300 days off of the penance imposed by the church. Now, it's really anachronistic, because if you really wanted to do it right today in contemporary terms, it would be like, well, this indulgence is worth 2 Hail Marys, because the penances imposed by the church are so much more lenient today. But the language of days off doesn't mean days off in purgatory. It's a reference to the imposition of penance in antiquity.